Hello and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Please sign up at my Patreon to get episodes earlier, bonuses, to have a say on future content, and to interact with me and other Warbirders directly. But mainly you'll have the satisfaction of helping keep this podcast going. You can also toss me a tip via PayPal at WOWB17, or even just drop me a review. Thank you for your support. Now on to the show. Bonjour, bienvenue dans le monde des avions de guerre. Je suis Brian Pierce. Comme il s'agit d'un avion français, et pour toute la première fois, je commenterai cet épisode entièrement en français. Just joking. C'est une blague. So what I said was, welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. As this is a French airplane, for the first time ever, I will be narrating the episode completely in French. But no. The vast majority of my listeners are in the USA, Australia, and Canada, and so I'd better stick to the King's English, or at least this Canadian colonists' version of it. To be honest, I probably wouldn't have chosen this one on my own, but it was a rather forceful suggestion from Tanner. Yes, the supersonic F-35 flying jet jockey wants me to do an episode on a pokey pre-war French bomber. Well, I'm going to comply. After all, she writes episodes for me. Quid pro quo. And guess what? She's working on an F-86 one for us. So, let's dive in. I've only ever looked at one other French aircraft, the 222 D-520. And it's not just me, right? French aviation gets totally overlooked in World War II, which is weird because France was basically the cradle of military aviation during World War I. I mean, even all these present-day aeronautical terms come from French. Aileron, from aile, little wing, and that's the hinged roll control surface. Fuselage, from fuseler, that means to streamline. Empennage, that's the tail assembly of an aircraft. Nacelle, that's the streamlined housing for engines. Canard or canard, duck, that's for a four-plane configuration. Hangar, that's an aircraft storage building. It means shed in French. And my favorite, Mayday, which comes from the French m'aider, which means help me. But in World War II, French aviation barely gets a mention. So let's take a closer look. Admittedly, the French Air Force, or l'Armée de l'Air, literally meaning the Army of the Air, had a bit of a muddled doctrine during the interwar years that was characterized by both a fundamental tension between emerging strategic ambitions and a rigid subordination to the French army. Although the l'Armée de l'Air had become an independent branch of the military in 1933, even before Germany or the USA, it very much remained a junior partner to the army. Doctrine prioritized a ground war with an emphasis on long-range reconnaissance and screening for infantry and artillery. Light and medium bombers would be used as tactical support weapons rather than strategic assets. Very much like the Luftwaffe, except that the Luftwaffe was more offensively minded. While some officers recognized the potential of long-range strategic bombing, these ideas were often marginalized by the Army's immediate tactical needs. Along with the overall French military strategy of relying on the Maginot Line, the Air Force was intended to play mainly a defensive role during the first phase of conflict, focusing on attrition and preventing the war from reaching French soil. This and the need for air policing in far-off colonial territories created an emphasis on tactical and logistical support rather than high-intensity continental warfare. All of what I just said would lead to two other decisions for the use of aircraft by France. As aircraft were not to be a primary tool, but rather as a support for the army, to save costs, France pursued the BCR, Bombardment, Combat, Reconnaissance concept. Known as the Avion à tout faire, or airplane that can do anything concept, it aimed to create single aircraft types that could serve as bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance platforms. Sometimes this works. The de Havilland Mosquito comes to mind. Often it doesn't, and the resulting aircraft were often underpowered and ill-suited for any specific role. Lastly, there was no emphasis on concentrated mass of air power, as would be seen in the USA or UK. Aircraft were often parceled out in small units, sometimes described as penny packets, to individual army formations for localized cover. This decentralized command and control made it impossible to achieve massed air superiority where needed. This was the environment that produced the Farman f.222. But before we dive into that, what's up with this English-sounding name for a French aircraft company? The company grew out of the work of the Farman brothers, Henri, Maurice, and Richard Farman, who were the sons of a British father and a French mother. Hence the English name. All three brothers were deeply involved in engineering and aviation at a time when powered flight was still experimental. Henri Farman was the most famous early on, a pilot, designer, and aviation celebrity. In 1908, flying a Voisin biplane of his own modification, Henri became the first person in Europe to fly a complete 1-kilometer closed circuit, a major milestone. By 1909, the brothers established Les Avions Farman, which became one of the first true aircraft manufacturers in the world, producing airplanes not as one-off experiments, but as standardized machines. Often, their design philosophy was to build with a pusher configuration and with an emphasis on stability, endurance, and great visibility. Although not sleek or fast, they were reliable, which mattered enormously in the fragile early years of aviation. The sum of these attributes meant that Farman aircraft were seen as well suited to training, reconnaissance, and bombing. During World War I, Farman became one of France's most important aviation suppliers. Some of their notable World War I aircraft included the Farman MF-7 and MF-11, Shorthorn and Longhorn, which were early reconnaissance aircraft used extensively in 1914 to 1915. As I was researching this one, the name Shorthorn jumped out at me. Yes! There is one at the Ottawa Museum. I never noticed it really, as it's not really from my preferred era. It was a pusher configuration recce aircraft, and it was called the Shorthorn because it had its elevator in the rear, as opposed to its sister, the Longhorn, which had its elevator sticking out in front like the Wright Flyer, or even Canada's own Silver Dart. Although they built other aircraft during World War I, the one that is most pertinent to our story is the Farman F-60 Goliath. And with a name like Goliath, you know it's going to be big. These were large, twin-engine biplane bombers, among the earliest examples of strategic bombing aircraft. They were almost 100 feet long with a wingspan of almost 80 feet. The Goliath came very late in 1918, but was pretty capable in that it could carry 1,000 kilograms, 2,200 pounds, of bombs, with a range of 1,500 kilometers or 930 miles. Imagine a giant twin-engine biplane with a very boxy fuselage, and you've got it. The DNA of our star today is definitely in the Goliath. As they were too late for combat, the type was converted into 14 passenger airliners, and they built 60 of them. Now that we've had a good introduction to the company, let's fast forward to the conception of our star today. The first iteration of the type, the Farman F.221, was a response to a January 1930 specification BN5 for a 5-seater night bomber. The type very gradually evolved over the next 8 years. It always surprises me just how slow aircraft development could be during the interwar years, and then how it picked up into a full-on sprint when the conflict began. So let me describe what the bomber looks like. If you can't see the images on Patreon right now, remember, those are free for everyone, or if you haven't seen it on War Thunder. It's a tail dragger with a big slab-high wing supported by several external struts, like my 172. From far off, it looks like a twin engine, but it actually has 4 engines, 2 in each nacelle, one turning a 3-bladed tractor or puller prop, and the other pushing at the rear. The engines were Nomron 14K DRS, which were 14-cylinder, 2-row, air-cooled radials. It was a rather interesting mixture of old and new styles. It had the boxy-shaped fuselage of the past, but it was of all metal construction, when many aircraft still had fabric. On the other hand, the landing gear was fixed, meaning that it stayed down, which would have caused a lot of drag. It featured 3 hand-operated turrets, and the nose was extensively glazed for the pilot, bombardier, and gunner. In fact, there's so much glass up there that it looks like a greenhouse, suitable for growing des tomates. The first flight of the prototype was on the 26th of May 1932, and 11 units of this type were produced and delivered. The slow speed of delivery and the very small numbers puts me in mind more of shipbuilding than aircraft construction, and as the years marched closer and closer to 1939, even as I write this, I'm thinking, you're going to need more. Many, many more. But there were problems with the F.221. Being smart warbirders, I'm sure you can guess some. Yes, the fixed gear was a major drag that slowed the plane down significantly. Also, you might guess that the rear air-cooled radials might have problems with cooling, and you'd be right. Also, the aircraft wasn't as stable as you might wish for a bombing platform. At the end of 1935, the new version to correct these issues made its first flight, and this one was the definitive f.222. The landing gear was made to be retractable, and the ends of the wing were modified with pronounced dihedral panels to improve the lateral stability. And improved engine cooling was incorporated. The last aircraft produced was manufactured in May 1938 for a grand total of 80 built. Now, normally I talk about survivors and where you can see the aircraft at the very end of the episode. But in this case, I'm going to spoil the ending by letting you know that no examples of any kind exist anywhere. So, if we want to experience the F.222, we've got pictures, videos, War Thunder, or the virtual reality of the mind, as I take you on a audio walkthrough. Alright, let's set the scene and walk up to the aircraft as if it's sitting on a French dispersal field in 1939. As you approach the Farman F.222, the first impression is one of sheer mass rather than elegance. Sitting high on its landing gear, the bomber feels imposing and almost architectural, its enormous high wing stretching wide overhead and casting a long shadow across the airfield. The aircraft is finished in the muted pre-war French camouflage of dark greens and browns on the upper surfaces with pale gray undersides and bold tricolore rondelles standing out against the weathered paint. Oil stains streak back from the 4 radial engines, and the matte finish is dulled by exhaust and exposure, giving the machine a worn, workmanlike appearance. The fuselage is long and slab-sided, punctuated by framed windows and gun positions, with, honestly, little attempt at streamlining. Up close, the Farman does not feel fast or aggressive. Instead, it conveys a sense of stubborn endurance, a bomber built to lift heavy loads into the night and keep going, trusting in darkness rather than speed for its survival. Let's step inside. We begin right at the front of the aircraft in the glazed nose compartment. Here sits the bombardier, who also doubles as the nose gunner. This position offers an excellent forward and downward view, critical for navigation and bombing during night operations. A flexible machine gun is mounted to defend against frontal attacks, although in reality, the aircraft's slow speed means that this was more symbolic rather than decisive. The bombardier uses a simple optical bomb sight, appropriate for the era and mission profile. Long, straight, level bombing runs conducted in darkness rather than precision daylight attacks. Just after the nose is the navigator's station, equipped with a drift sight and desk for paper charts and the navigator doing dead reckoning calculations. The F.222 was designed for long-range night missions, and navigation was often the most demanding job on board. There was no radar, and so discipline, experience, and calculations of time, wind, speed, and heading over a dark terrain were the only ways to know the way. Moving upward and slightly aft, we arrived at the raised cockpit, one of the aircraft's most distinctive features. The F.222 was flown by the pilot and co-pilot, seated side by side, with large, simple, semicircular yokes. Big manual throttles and mixture controls and engine instruments grouped for all four engines. The elevated position provided excellent forward visibility over the long nose and even had glazing down the sides of the cockpit so the pilots could look down for bombing runs. Moving aft into the heart of the aircraft, we reach the bomb bay. The F.222 could carry approximately 2,200 kilograms, that's 4,900 pounds, of bombs, stored internally to reduce drag, a modern feature for the early 1930s and a notable step towards more modern bomber design. Though detailed documentation on how these compartments were accessed or how their doors operated is not well preserved in primary technical references. Bombs were manually selected and released with manual release levers and group or stick releases, not automated sequencing. Some examples of weapons loads would be 10 200 kilogram number 1 bombs, 4 500 kilogram number 2 bombs, 5 200 kilogram number 1 bombs, plus 7 100 kilogram number 1 bombs, or 52 50 kilogram bombs. That last one would have a cluster bomb-like effect. Great for doing damage to enemy columns. Above the fuselage, just after the wing, is the dorsal gun station. This position housed a flexible Mach 1934 7.5mm machine gun with a wide field of fire, intended to protect the bomber from high rear attacks. The Mach 1934 had drum and belt-fed versions, and I haven't been able to find out which our F.222 was equipped with. However, we do know that it had no power turrets, no armor protection, and a fairly limited ammunition supply. Below the fuselage sits the retractable ventral gunner's position, one of the least comfortable and most dangerous stations on the aircraft. The gunner defended against attacks from below and behind, a known weak point for large bombers. The position offered poor visibility, extreme cold, and minimal protection. Do you like this show? Please consider supporting me at World of Warbird's Patreon. It's only $5 a month. There are advantages to being a supporting patron of the podcast. I get a lot of suggestions on Spotify, but it's my Patreon supporters that have the greatest say on future content. But mainly, you'll have the satisfaction of keeping the podcast going. You can also toss me a tip via PayPal at WOWB17, or even just share me with a friend. It all helps, and I appreciate it more than you know. With the outbreak of war, Farmans were first used in leaflet dropping missions over Germany, and then later on, there were actual bombing missions, such as one on the BMW factories in Munich on May 14, 1940. On that night, the French Air Force's Groupement de Bombardement 115 flew night bombing missions over Germany, including targets in Bavaria, which would have encompassed industrial facilities such as the BMW engine and aircraft plants in Munich. On the 14th of June 1940, Farman f.222 serial L.229 saw the aircraft being hit by German flak over the target area. The fuel tanks were holed, and the bomber ran out of fuel on the return flight and was forced to crash land in the countryside. But the crew survived the landing. In the end, the total tonnage of bombs dropped was about 140 tons, which is quite low. Supposedly, only 2 aircraft were lost, one previously mentioned, and the other due to accident. So, low losses due to low usage, and low tonnage dropped. It makes sense. After the armistice, the Farmans were transferred to North Africa and relegated to transport roles. Interestingly, seeing service with both the Vichy regime and the Free French. Before we wrap up the F.222, we have to talk about Georges Denis, a remarkable French aviator and free French fighter ace, whose story spans the fall of France to service with the Allies and high honors in the post-war era. He was born on the 1st of February 1906 in La Jarrie-Audouin, Charente-Maritime, into a farming family. He enlisted in the French Air Force in 1925, initially serving as an aircraft gunner before training as a pilot and earning his fighter pilot wings in 1929. In the 1930s, he flew with fighter units in the Rhineland occupation, later moving to Dijon with Escadrille 2-3, Les Lévriers, until health issues forced him off of active fighter duty, and into an instructor's role, training navigators and radio operators at Saint-Jean-d'Angély. When France fell in 1940, Denis refused to accept defeat. On the 20th of June 1940, he seized an aircraft. Which one do you think? Yes, a Farman F.220 bomber from Saint-Jean-d'Angély, and flew it along with 19 other fellow servicemen to the UK, where he joined up with the Free French forces rallying there. Once in Britain, Denis retrained with the Royal Air Force on Hawker Hurricanes and soon entered combat for the Free French. He took part in the Battle of Dakar and later fought in North Africa and the Middle East, serving with RAF squadrons attached to Free French units. In April 1941, at Tobruk, Denis formed the Escadrille Française de Chasse Numéro 1, EFC-1, the first Free French fighter squadron under RAF command, where he and his pilots scored 12 enemy aircraft destroyed in under 2 months. Denis himself was credited with 6 confirmed aerial victories, including twice downing German ace Hans Joachim Marseille. On the 21st of June 1941, EFC-1 became the first military unit awarded the Croix de la Libération, the Cross of Liberation, and Denis was individually appointed a Companion of the Liberation, one of France's highest wartime honors. He took command of the Groupe de Chasse Alsace in 1942, and after the liberation of France, Denis worked as a defense expert at the National Assembly in Paris. He remained in the French Air Force until retiring as a colonel in 1954, and later served as a director of several companies, finally passing away on the 21st of June 2003 at the age of 97. And absolutely none of that would have occurred had it not been for our star today, the big, slow, pokey Farman. So what happened to the Farman Company? Well, in 1936, France actually began a major nationalization of the aviation industry, and Farman was absorbed into the Société Nationale de Construction Aéronautique du Centre, SNCAC, one of the several state-run aviation conglomerates. From this point, the Farman name disappeared from new aircraft designs, although its engineers and designers certainly influenced SNCAC projects. Well, if you are listening to this through Patreon, well, thank you for your support. Until next time.